Hello, my name is Nicholas O'Brien, and I am coming to you from my Colorado studio. And today I'm going to talk about three specific works that I feel are kind of emblematic of my visual practice overall, and the kind of threads that are pervasive in a lot of the work that I do. So I want to start with a work that was made in 2009, 2010. That's called Grasswalk. And during this time, I was kind of transitioning between doing explicitly experimental video work and more into kind of a digital art or new media or net art based practice. And I was experimenting with using this video game engine called Hammer, which is the engine that is used to build maps and script sequences for the video game Half-Life 2, published by Valve. So this engine was really popular for making customizable maps, for making customizable scenarios for games and offshoots and other types of environments for the central core of Half-Life. And with this engine came a lot of really useful tools and a lot of really useful material, part of which was this really extensive and really well put together package of textures and objects and gestures and characters that you could all incorporate into this editor. So initially when I was starting to make work using this, I was making these really kind of intensive, really overblown, kind of very elaborate environments, these maps that were had multiple avenues to them, multiple rooms, interiors, exteriors, multiple characters, multiple sequences, so on and so forth. And I realized through kind of working through that material and working on that material that I wanted to reduce those scenes into a lot more manageable environments and a lot more kind of quiet environments. Not spaces that had a lot of interactivity per se, but to really use the first-person camera because you kind of play as a first-person Half-Life as a first-person shooter. To use the character as a camera mechanism, and so I started paring down these environments more and more into kind of these really reduced scenes. Very small rooms with very kind of sparse furniture and very monotonous actions, and try and splice those together in some type of creative way. But even more so than that, I started to become just really interested in the textures that were used in this game environment and how the textures operated within the overall simulation component of the game. Specifically, I was really interested in how the landscape texturing in the game operated and how the landscape texturing in the game was meant to simulate this 3D depth, as if when you were walking on grass or gravel, it would seem like you were really walking on something three-dimensional, but you were actually walking on something, extremely flat, just totally 2D. So I was interested in how this 2D representation was meant to simulate 3D space within 3D space, and how textures operate really on that premise of simulating more depth and more dimensionality within a 3D environment, continuing to use 2D techniques. This seemed particularly the case for, again, these natural textures. And when I started kind of looking at them more and more, and the more I started using them within this map building environment, within Hammer, the more I started to kind of like see past their simulation and just start looking at them as these kind of patterns of pixels and colors. So I was really interested in kind of accentuating that and highlighting that, and in talking about how something that's really rudimentary in its design, these kind of pixel shifting, is really supposed to emulate these really complex environments, these really complex landscapes. So I built this map that ostensibly looks like a kind of semicircular half dome. And within this environment, you can script cameras to do specific motions and specific kind of tracking. So you can not only use yourself as the first person as a camera, but you can also use cameras built within the game to do these what are called scripted sequences. So I designed this map that was just purely this one texture, this one default grass texture that's in the game. And I scripted this camera to move along this kind of curve of this map in a somewhat slow fashion, but for it to be slightly indeterminate. So that at certain moments it would go quicker, and in other moments it would go a little bit more slowly. And as I was scripting this environment, I realized that the camera movement itself actually accentuated this pixelization and this abstraction. And if you kind of looked at this movement and this motion long enough, these environments would just kind of turn into these color-filled paintings. Of course moving, but these color fields. So I took recordings based upon this camera movement that I had made in this map, and I accentuated that pixelization even more in kind of a post-process. And I came up with this video Grasswalk, which is a looping kind of single-channel video with a very simple analog synthesizer score to accompany it. And the piece is kind of slow and meditative in this way that I really like, but it's also keys into, or was also very important for me because it keyed into this underlying notion that I had in my practice at that time that now is very central, which is trying to discover and trying to analyze why landscape is still important within digital environments, and why the kind of need for representing landscape is becoming more and more important, in my opinion, for digital artists, working against or away from the kind of realism that is now happening in a lot of 3D simulation. So this work was really important and really integral to the development of my practice, in that not only was it hinting at this shift that was happening between 3D representations of landscape from this two-dimensionality that was happening in Half-Life to this much more complex, much more volumetric landscape rendering that's happening in more contemporary video games. So not only marking that, but also marking this interest that I was keying into, this interest that I thought that was becoming more pervasive in the conversation of digital arts about what the purposes of representing landscape are doing within a contemporary conversation. This kind of came to a head, or is probably best well known, this strand of research is probably best well known in this exhibition that I mounted last year at 319 Shoals in Brooklyn, called Notes on a New Nature. And in that exhibition, I curated a number of artists together, I think the number was 18 artists together, that were dealing with issues of landscape and digital technology in one way or another. There's various kind of offshoots and different manifestations of what that investigation looked like. Some of it was kind of digital painting, some of it was looking at simulated 3D environments and thinking about interior versus exterior. Others of them were much more abstract, thinking about place and architecture and responding to those areas. And others of them were just much more about simulation. What does simulation do to landscape in terms of our connection to it, our association to it, our understanding of it. And so this thread of research is kind of expanded into talking about other modes of representation that have happened in art history, and other moments that have happened in art history that mark these places where abstraction seems to be a more faithful undertaking in terms of capturing landscape than kind of very, very observational and very detail-oriented representations. So more recently, I've been kind of playing with this idea of history, playing with this idea of how can we look at historical moments, art historical moments of representing landscape, and looking at these moments of deviation away from faithful representation, faithful kind of pictorial representation into abstraction, and then drawing an equivalence between those art historical moments and a moment that I think that we're currently in. So that being said, I'm going to kind of segue into, I'll kind of come back to that a little bit later, this idea of history and this idea of how to interact with art history and rekindle conversations from previous eras, previous epochs. But I want to kind of segue into this other kind of branch of my work that deals with performance and that deals with kind of more gestures of performative investigations of identity, self, and this interaction between surface, screen, and space, kind of public space. So, and this segue involves an anecdote that I like telling that involves, coincidentally, this piece that I just got done talking about, Grasswalk. So when I first moved to the Denver area in 2010, I was invited to participate in this exhibition in the small gallery show at this space called the Manual Gallery in Denver. And I was the only artist in the show that probably would think of themselves as being media-based, as being kind of a new media or digital artists. And so I installed Grasswalk as a 2-channel projection. One channel was flat against a wall, and the other channel was leaning down against the floor, so that the video piece would kind of extend down into the floor, somewhat harkening back to the original map that I made, but again also harkening back to this idea of simulating 3-dimensional space with a 2-dimensional kind of flat surface. So within kind of the first maybe 20 minutes of the show, these two 20-something girls come in, and my piece is located right at the kind of the first kind of foyer of this gallery. So it's one of the first pieces that you interact with, or the first pieces that you see when you walk into the space. And these two girls proceeded to do all of these hand gestures in front of this projected piece. Stand in front of the piece, do hand gestures in front of it, do these like bunny ears, like talking mouths, and they did this for about half an hour, interacting with this piece in this way. And I was really somewhat troubled at first, and then just kind of stupefied that this type of interactivity seemed so novel to these audience members, to these two ladies. And they did this for a long time, and they seemed to be like ceaselessly entertained by their interjecting within this projected space. And you know, to someone like myself that is fairly familiar with an art history of projection in the gallery, which has been existing for more than 45 years, this sense of novelty and this sense of just kind of overwhelming joyfulness that something was projected into the space was really, really interesting to me and really strange. And at the time of the show, I was watching them perform these tasks in front of this work, and after I had kind of gotten over the initial kind of insult or the initial kind of offense that I might have taken with their interaction with this piece, I came to kind of enjoy their weird silliness. And an artist friend of mine came over and asked me if I was watching this, and I was like, yeah, I am watching this. And his name is Adán de la Garza, and he asked me, what I thought about what they were doing, what were they accomplishing, and I just kind of quickly replied or quipped with him that oh, they're just getting to me first, but they'll get around to the rest of the work in the show eventually. And the rest of the work in the show was much more traditional work, painting and sculpture, that kind of thing. And this joke of doing shadow puppets in front of paintings became something that gave me great pause, and something that I thought as a joke could extend itself beyond just the simple humor, but really speak about the way that we do interact in a novel way to things that exist in museums, non-projected work that exists in museums, and the kind of latent novelty that happens within museological and kind of institutional contexts. So Adan and I did this piece called Shadow Puppets in Front of Paintings, and we initially, trained ourselves as best as we could in the shortest amount of time possible to develop a repertoire of shadow puppet phrases and shadow puppet movements, and proceeded to go to the Denver Art Museum and perform these shadow puppets in front of the paintings that they have there. And we were just under the assumption that these shadow puppets would work because we were familiar with the kind of apparatus and the infrastructure of museum exhibitions and museum showcasing of work. The lighting is a particular way, and shadows would be cast as a result of this lighting. And lo and behold, we were actually correct in that assumption that these paintings would have shadow kind of surfaces that we would be able to perform within and play with. So luckily for us, the Denver Art Museum has a fairly extensive collection of painting, and particularly an extensive collection of kind of romantic mid-18th or mid-19th century landscape painting of the West. They're very keen on representing the history of the Western landscape through painting and through that kind of genre of painting, of American painting at least. So we proceeded to do a number of shadow puppets in front of paintings of the American West, but also paintings of more kind of modernist-leaning artists. Artists like Philip Guston is a good example in that work. And as the day went on, we were kind of terrified that we were going to get caught and thrown out of the museum for violating this kind of bubble of preservation of these works. But we didn't set off any of the alarms, and we didn't get into any trouble. But as the day went on, other patrons of the museum saw us doing this and started laughing alongside of what we were doing. They were kind of participating in the joke just by witnessing what we were doing and witnessing how the kind of fourth wall of the museum apparatus can be kind of interrupted so easily. And they started laughing with us and started also doing gestures in front of the paintings as well. And then, right near the end of the day, as we were in the kind of more contemporary and modern section, a guard caught us, just kind of caught us by coming around the corner right when we were doing this work. And they didn't say anything. They laughed and they kind of chuckled. And then they too also started making kind of gestures in front of these paintings and gestures in front of the work that probably they had memorized in terms of their familiarity because they work in that environment. And that's when things started really clicking with that piece in terms of thinking about this association of interactivity between the museum patron and the work on the wall. I think that a lot of times it's very easy to kind of glaze over works and glaze over the content of works as a result of the kind of touristic tendencies that large museums like the Denver Art Museum have. They're trying to cater to a wide breadth of population, and they're trying to showcase artwork that not only complements the collection and complements Denver as a city, but also allows for people that are not necessarily well versed in art vernacular to have some form of appreciation and have some kind of give and take experience. So this gesture and having these artists and then these other audience members and this guard interact with this work, we felt as though it really allowed or highlighted or accentuated this need for new ways of responding to and new ways of interjecting into the conversation that happens within kind of museological environments. So we thought, right, this is a pretty good idea. We thought that we should do it again. And so we had a chance in 2011 I was in Chicago and Adon came out and visited, and we re-performed the piece, or a variation of the piece, at the Art Institute of Chicago. And this time, the Art Institute of Chicago is significantly more crowded than the Denver Art Museum, just because of the sheer volume of material that they have, of work that they have, and it was also at the height of summer, so very much a touristy season. So we had to really navigate between these kind of droves of tourists, or just droves of people in general, moving through this museum at a fairly rapid pace, and also still trying to avoid the guards, because we were still uncertain whether or not they would be okay with us doing this performance. But we continued to do the performance. We executed the performance, and we were doing these shadow puppets, and we had almost the exact same reaction of other patrons, starting to do gestures in front of the painting, starting to laugh with us or at us, and really starting to reignite this intrigue and reignite this will to gravitate towards the works and to get really close to them and interact with them. So during this moment, or during this performance of when we were wrapping up the day of doing these shadow puppets in front of the various paintings at the Art Institute, we were upstairs, and I was getting ready to do this performance in front of a Yves Tanguy, doing this bird shadow puppet in front of the Yves Tanguy. And I proceeded to do this, and as I was doing this young girl of about 8 or 9 walked into the gallery and watched me perform this gesture and watched me perform this action. And as soon as I was done performing it, I kind of walked away, and she immediately came up to the painting and proceeded to do almost the exact same gesture, mimic it, but was absolutely delighted in the result that she got, where she was able to see her own shadow on this piece and have this layer of kind of intimacy and layer of agency with this work. And it was one of just the most magical experiences that I've had with kind of art making, or with just art in general, because it really tapped into the sensibility that I have with performance, and that it's a very immediate exchange. It's a very immediate process. The artist and the audience are both occupying the same space and are both presumably present in the same way. And that there's a real-time conversation that happens in those moments that's very rare in institutional frameworks and very rare in kind of museological conversations, because there's so many things that hinder that process. There's so many layers of mediation that happen between artist and audience in terms of framing and kind of conceptualization and presentation and preservation and so on and so forth. So to have this more immediate exchange, not only with the audience members, not only with other patrons in the museum, but to also have this immediate exchange with the art itself that we were performing kind of on top of, or performing with, was something that I think that really ties into an earlier conversation that I was having about thinking about this history, how to work within a contemporary conversation, whether it be through digital frameworks of video games or contemporary performance or kind of contemporary network technology, how to take that information and work within a conversation that has already existed, work within a conversation that can be continued, given these new formats of communication and these new formats of exchange. So in that sense, I was really interested, since kind of both of those works, I've become increasingly more interested in working within that framework of thinking about art history or thinking about cultural history and thinking about what information exists in those moments or in those narratives and stories and so on and so forth that can lend themselves to a revitalizing of a conversation or a revitalizing of a concern, a social or cultural concern that we have currently. And so this kind of brings me actually up into the most recent work that I want to talk about, which is called A Temporary Monument for Jobbers Canyon, built with products by ConAgra, or built with products from ConAgra. And this project is a 2011-2012 Turbulence Commission for the website turbulence.org, and is funded by, or was made possible by funding from the NEA. And this project is a project that I've been working on for a long time, for over a year, in terms of research and collecting data and thinking about and kind of doing tests for. And it consists of a series of 10 videos that are 3D animations of these buildings in this neighborhood, in this historic neighborhood in Omaha, Nebraska called Jobbers Canyon. And before I talk about those videos, I want to talk about this history and context and kind of this story or narrative that motivates this piece, informs it. So in 1989, this neighborhood, this historic district in Omaha, Nebraska called Jobbers Canyon was demolished by this company ConAgra, which is the second largest agricultural distributor in the country. And they demolished this neighborhood, which is about 6.5 city blocks and consisted of 24 buildings. They demolished this neighborhood in order to build their, I think, executive or corporate headquarters. And this site, this historic site, is the largest site that was listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Coincidentally, now, after this decision to demolish these buildings, it's considered the largest lost site within the National Register of Historic Places. The site itself consisted of these 24 buildings that were built between the late 1880s and the early 1900s, approximately between 1885 and about 1910 or so. After that, these buildings have been some buildings have been rehabilitated, some buildings have been modified slightly, but most of them were completely intact from their original construction. So they were these amazing kind of living testaments to this history of what's called Renaissance Revival style architecture, which was a very popular style in the turn of the previous century for warehouses, for large kind of wholesale storage spaces and stuff like that. So they were very practical and very utilitarian, but also very, in some instances, had interesting takes on ornamentation that would be partially just pure ornament, but also partially functional. So this architectural style was very common in the Midwest for these types of warehouse buildings, and there's not many kind of still standing pieces of evidence for this type of Renaissance Revival style. So this neighborhood was very, very important in the establishment of Omaha as being a central city for agricultural distribution and agricultural warehousing. And the name of this site, the name of this historic district, Jobbers Canyon, comes from this activity called jobbing, or these people called jobbers, that acted as these kind of mediaries between wholesale businesses and kind of mom and pop shops or shop owners. So they acted as kind of contract salesmen that would work for companies like the John Deere Company, or they would work for companies like Fairbanks, Morse and Company, or they would work for things like the Allen Brothers Company or the Kingman Implement Company, or the U.S. Supply Company. A lot of these kind of agricultural and kind of wholesale distributors of goods for agricultural implement working. And a lot of these companies were really integral towards establishing the United States as being this force of commerce and force of economic thriving in the early part of the 1900s. Unfortunately now, or not unfortunately, but a lot of those companies have been kind of eaten up or dismantled or dissolved since then. But these buildings had remained, and a lot of these buildings had been commissioned by these companies, by local architects, local Nebraskan and Omaha architects. So when ConAgra decided to demolish these buildings, citizens from Omaha were very, very outraged and very, very disappointed, and fought vigorously for the preservation of these buildings, especially because these buildings were listed within the National Register, and how that, as a demarcating of historical and cultural importance, seemed to be inconsequential to the corporate interest of ConAgra. So this project then takes the original architectural plans of 10 of these buildings and rebuilds them kind of brick by brick using this program called Blender. And these bricks are kind of made of or are constituted by products that ConAgra distributes. Products like Orville Redenbacher, Swiss Miss, Mary Callender's, Slim Jim, stuff like that. So these buildings are kind of retextured or rearranged. Instead of being simulated as having the original material, which is mostly concrete and masonry and timber frames, are instead retextured with these products that ConAgra distributes. And then as a result of this kind of, metaphorically as a result of this retexturing, these buildings kind of explode given the pressure of this corporate interest. So these videos then are these, they're these kind of single channel video loops of these exploding buildings. And they're kind of slow and somewhat meditative, but they're about a minute and a minute and a half long. So the reason why this project is really important to me is because it's marking this relocation of where I want my practice to go and what I'd like to say with the work that I've been making up to this point, which is avoiding the tendency of trying to make something very immediate or trying to respond to something in a very kind of reactionary and or undigested, unprocessed way. Instead of doing that, instead of using the technology available that we have so readily with kind of contemporary computing and contemporary network technology, instead of using those tools to their kind of immediate reward, I want to instead investigate what it means to kind of linger on an idea or linger on a process or a space or a site. Because I think that through the faithfulness of our representation, through being able to simulate and emulate spaces and histories and sites and architecture and stuff like that, being able to do that so well now with contemporary technology is, to me, kind of besides the point. What's more important to me is re-experiencing and re-investigating this process of loss, this process of giving away, of forsaking a cultural history for the sake of corporate progress or for the sake of the now for the sake of the immediate. So in some ways I'm trying to combat the eagerness that happens with digital technology to invest in the novel, to invest in the new, whether it be new gear or new methods or something like that, and instead to investigate the historical and what the historical can teach us about, or what lessons can be learned from those previous moments that need continued evaluation and continued reflection. Because I think continuing to repeat what happened at at Jobbers Canyon with ConAgra would for that to repeat and for that to continue, for that to be so pervasive within the conversation of contemporary America, I think would really sorely forsake the possibility that we have of understanding our cultural identity much more in-depthly through the lens of history, through the lens of what we already have, what we've already established for ourselves, and kind of the lineage and legacy of what it means to live in this country. Of course, a lot of that has changed. A lot of that is continuing to change, and a lot of that continues to need to be reevaluated. However, my insistence upon using contemporary technology to investigate what those moments have to continue to share with us now is that so much of how we understand our contemporary selves is built upon the legacy of our families and of our predecessors. And being able to understand and being able to, not fully understand, but being able to glean some understanding from the mindset and the problems and the potential maybe temporary solutions that previous generations have built or have sustained in those moments can help guide and or warn of approaches that we might feel could be beneficial now. So instead of immediately going towards, so the past is an interesting territory in that not only does it offer us immediate answers to previous solutions or previous problems, but it also, in my hope, it offers us alternatives in kind of what not to do. Instead of demolishing these buildings, we could have, and there was plans to do this at that moment, there was plans to revitalize those buildings, rehab those buildings in order for the sake of a different type of reinvigoration of the downtown area. So the hope for that work and for future work that I'm currently developing, I'm looking at these kind of recent histories, I'm looking at these recent moments and somewhat in other moments that are not so recent, to think about what could be learned from those moments, but also what to avoid in those in the pitfalls of previous generations. What can be beneficial and what can be kind of sustained, and where I can locate myself as a creative thinker within a context of lineage and history, but also where to deviate, where to take these new tools and take these new systems and platforms of exchange and use them in their kind of really crucially beneficial core, how to distribute work and distribute conversation in a way that's non-centralized, that's not as institutionalized as previous generations. So those are kind of the three central tracks of kind of what my research and what my thinking is revolving around at the moment, that being landscape, performance, and kind of social cultural history. So I hope that was informative, and please feel free to try to get in touch with me. You can either visit my website at double_net, that's spelled out, or you can find me at various other social media platforms. Thank you so much.